Everything in the letter is true. Everything in the letter happened to me. And I just think about how much I wish I was prepared for the world that I was going to be in. I grew up in a Puerto Rican household, so that side of me was all I knew. But when I got to college, I wasn't embraced by the Latino community, and not even realizing that it's because I'm a Black Puerto Rican, right? So having to struggle with that, and even now as an adult, still struggling with the anti-Blackness within my community, the colorism and all the things that we'll get into in the conversation. But really wanting to let y'all know that this is personal. Yes, it's research-based and things like that, but I'm also speaking from personal experience. I don't know why the devil's a liar. Come on. Amen. So anti-Blackness. Just so y'all know, I don't lecture because lecture is boring, so I expect y'all to participate. So when y'all think about anti-Blackness, what kind of things come to mind? And y'all are welcome to put it in the chat too, even though I can't see it. My girl over here is gonna let me know if people comment. So what kind of things come to mind? Okay. She said institutionalized racism for those of y'all who didn't hear. What else? Okay, I'll give you the official definition. That is okay. So here it says anti-Blackness is more than prejudice or bias. It is a multifaceted paradigm of thought and action that works against the survival and life chances of Black people, ideas, and ways of being in the world through structures of white supremacist domination. Right. So exactly what you're talking about in terms of institutionalized racism. It's not just the idea of, oh, I don't like Black people. Right. It is the systems of oppression in this country that are intentionally holding down Black folks. Right. So it's a lot deeper than just prejudice, is a lot deeper than just experiencing microaggression, even though both of those have negative psychological impacts on us as Black folks, but it's talking about the systems that are contributing to the experiences of Black folks in this country. Dr. Stewart says anti-Blackness hides within the rhetoric of inclusion, unexamined and unchecked, excluding and targeting Black people through ideologies of absence, right? So anti-Blackness isn't always just outright prejudice or racism towards Black folks. It is also the erasure of us or ignoring us completely, right? So as I started the talk talking about how Afro-Latinos and Latinos are often not even considered, where we're not even talked about when people create events for Latinx Heritage Month, the Afro-Latino experience is often not even a part of that, right? And people don't acknowledge that that absence of us is rooted in anti-Black, right? So oftentimes, because people don't equate being Black with being Latino, right? They think that the two can't exist. There's the idea of some Latinos that don't want to acknowledge the fact that we are part of that community, right? So there's sometimes where we're intentionally ignored and sometimes subconsciously ignored, but both are rooted in anti-Black. So when we think about the Latinx community, what does it look like in our community? So part of it is a preference for whiteness. And I'll talk deeper into what that is, but there's this idea that white is right. And a lot of Latinos that are pushing away the Black folks in our community or are anti-Black is because there is this preference for whiteness, this desire for a proximity to whiteness, because they believe and have bought into the idea that white is superior and being Black is not a good thing. Colorism is alive and well and running rampant within the Black community, within the Latino community, but also within the African American community as well. Just this idea that having lighter skin is better. I know for me, growing up, every time we were at the beach, I was often told not to be in the sun because I was going to get too dark. And being too dark was a bad thing, right? And I think even as a young girl, not realizing that that was anti-Blackness, right? Not realizing that's because they were equating darkness with being something bad, right? And then me internalizing it myself, especially because I was the only dark person in my family anyway. So this idea that me looking even more like myself and not looking like the rest of my family was seen as a negative thing. And then erasure, so what I've already been talking about, so this idea of not including us in Latinx Heritage Month or not having us be on the cover of Latina magazine. If you see a lot of Spanish soap operas and TV shows and things like that, the attractive women are always very fair skinned. And the maids tend to be dark skinned or heavy set. If it's the funny person or things like that, then those people get to be dark skinned. But the main characters, the beautiful ones, are very rarely my complexion or darker. So let's dig deeper into what a preference for whiteness is. So when you think about whiteness in general, what it means, whiteness refers to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history have created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal. When we think about whiteness, a lot of people conflate being white with whiteness, and they're not the same thing, right? So being white, you were born a white person, that is who you are, that is your racial identity. Whiteness is this idea in this country that white is the standard. Everything associated with being white is the standard. It's seen as positive, it is seen as good, it is seen as the thing that we should all be aspiring to. And as a result, everything that is not that is seen as abnormal or deviant or less than, right? So when we talk about whiteness and the danger of whiteness, we're not saying that white folks are bad. We're not saying that white folks are bad. We're saying whiteness and this idea that those of us who don't measure up to this Eurocentric standard are seen as inferior or less. Does that make sense? Whiteness, not good. White people, good. Okay? And I feel like I have to say it that way because folks really think when we talk about whiteness that we're being anti-white, and that is not at all what it is we're talking about when we're talking about white. Okay, so this was super fascinating. So this is a study, and it is a little bit older, but I still want to talk about what it looks like. So what this data is talking about right here, that 75% of the folks that are Mexican, Cuban, or Puerto Rican actually have African ancestry. So meaning that 75% of those communities are considered Afro-Latino or would be considered Afro-Latino. And then in South America, it ranges between 5 to 25%. So for this study, they found people from these communities and asked them if they self-identify as of having African descent or being Afro-Latino. So when you think about these first ones, Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the 75%, what percentage of them do you think actually identify as Black? Yes. 5? Oh, 5. Did you watch my presentation before I got here? Because 5 is the highest, right? So if you look at this here, it's saying that Mexico, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, right? So here, so I mean, it went up a little bit, but this one went down. So the highest out of all of them is 6%, right? Even though this is saying that 75% actually have African ancestry, they are not acknowledged, right? So I think part of it is just a lack of knowledge of your ancestry, right? So I think there are a lot of folks that don't know that being Latino is not a race, right? Like that is our ethnicity. Like there are white Latinos, there are Black Latinos, there are indigenous Latinos. I think part of it is a lack of knowledge of that, but a lot of it is a rejection of Blackness because Blackness is seen as inferior and not as good as being something else. So this, I think for me, like I figured it was going to be lower, but this amount of lower, I definitely wasn't expecting. And I'd be interested in seeing what those numbers look like today. And yes, that's 30 years later, but I still highly doubt that it's anywhere near what the actual number is supposed to be according to data. So oftentimes, like I said, people do not acknowledge the fact that Latinos can also be Black. So what do you think is potentially problematic about these pictures? Mm-hmm. Right. So a lot of these pictures came out last summer during the whole racial awakening, even though the country was voluntarily asleep, but that's a different talk for a different day. But when people were supporting the George Floyd protests and things like that, we saw a lot of these pictures being circulated in social media and things like that. And although they were well intentioned, when you look at them, if it's Latinos for Black lives, it erases the fact that there are Latinos that are Black, right? So for us as Afro Latinos, it was frustrating because I'm like, great, y'all should be on the front lines fighting as well. However, you're also fighting for members of your own community, right? So even in trying to do good and trying to fight for Black lives, which is the opposite of anti-Black, right? There's still anti-Blackness in it because they're ignoring the fact that we are also part of the Latinx community. We have a lot of work to do, y'all, as a community. So I want to talk about Dr. Haywood's work in terms of anti-Black Latino racism, because yes, there's anti-Blackness within the non-Latino Black community, so for African Americans, Africans, and things like that. But this specifically is talking about what it looks like within the Latinx community. So she has a couple of quotes in terms of what her experience has been like. And this one says, it's my read it, it frustrates me. My mom would joke around and say she was going to bathe me in milk. One of the jokes she used to say when I asked why I was darker than everyone else was that she left me in the oven for too long. Yeah. So growing up, I always wanted to be lighter skinned, and I found myself not attractive because I was dark skinned. I had never heard the bathe in milk before, but when I did one of these for a predominantly Latinx group, about half of them have been told something similar by their parents. So this idea of wanting to lighten their skin, and there are a lot of Latino countries that do skin lightening and skin bleaching and things like that. So this idea of her being baked in the oven to look right. So this idea of us being burnt because we are too dark, right? So this is her as a little girl being told these things, and even though I think our family members like, oh, we're just joking, but there's still some truth behind it, right? Even those jokes are rooted in anti-Blackness and this idea that kind of that preference for whiteness that I talked about, right? The colorism, the fact that lighter is better and we should be aspiring to that and staying away from being darker by any means. Okay. So that this is another one. So she talks about skin privilege and colorism. Like I told you before, is one of the ways it shows up in our community. So this one says the refusal to name the fact that Zimmerman and others within the Latino community have access to light skin or white skin privilege and therefore benefit from colorism and in turn white supremacy is a large part of why anti-Black Latino racism persists. So Zimmerman was the man that murdered Trayvon Martin, right? And there was I think a lot of things came out during that time, right? So at first, everyone will say he's a white man, he's racist, he murdered a Black child. But then a lot of folks are like, oh, he's not Black, he's Latino, so it doesn't count. One, him being Latino doesn't mean he's not white. And two, they were trying to remove the racial aspect of it. They were trying to move the anti-Blackness or the racist. But I'm just like, no, he can still be motivated by anti-Blackness. And a lot of things that happened with him were also related to the skin privilege he had, right? To the light skin privilege he had. Because had he been a darker skinned Latino, would he have gotten off? Would he have been seen the same way? Would he have been treated the same way? Obviously, we don't know. It's all speculation. But a lot of people were trying to, it was scapegoating, it was gaslighting, all the things that they like to do often when it comes to racially motivated incidents. But just the fact that he was Latino does not mean that his act wasn't racist. It doesn't mean that he was not motivated or influenced by anti-Black. Did any of y'all hear those narratives or conversations about it when it first came up? Do you think people understood that he could be white and Latino at the same time?
I think that was part of the community for him. I heard on some of my conservative friends were quick to bring up, well, who's Latino? So it can't be a race issue.
Mm-hmm.
bringing in some sort of unity from this being a quote unquote racial issue. It didn't fit in the black-white line.
Mhm.
So that's the different issue.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like it gave him immunity because I feel like a lot of the white folks were like, oh, phew, it wasn't us. Like we didn't do that. And I'm like, what? Let's kind of dig deeper into that. But even of course we're talking about it now and what it looks like. But have y'all ever struggled seeing Latinos as not a race and understanding that there are Black Latinos and Indigenous and white folks? Because I know me growing up, I didn't always see it that. Like I was Puerto Rican and my dad's African American, so I always saw myself as Puerto Rican and Black. Growing up, it wasn't until I got to college and actually learned my history. I'm like, actually, the Puerto Ricanness is also Black. So even as a member of the community, I struggled with it and had to learn and do my work when it comes to that. But here's the question, when did y'all realize or learn that Latinos could be Black or white or Indigenous, Asian?
For me, it was in high school. I grew up in the inner city of Chicago, where it's still very much segregated, the communities are. And so it didn't, the dots didn't begin to connect until we had started to have those types of conversations. And very like interesting classes that I wasn't expecting to sort of have those types of conversations in. And I was privileged to have several African American sort of mentors throughout that process to help understand why for us the topic is violence, and that's what we're sort of discussing here, but violence looks different and we understand it differently sometimes when you live in the inner city. So I honestly did not even begin to have those types of conversations until I was married.
Yeah. Anyone else remember when you found out, or maybe you're still learning? And that's okay too.
For me, it wasn't until I was a doc student. So Jasmine was actually part of my doc program, and we were hiring a new faculty member, and we were organizing because we wanted a new Black faculty, because our program had, at the time, I think we had 20 Black doc students, which was unheard of. So we were like, y'all recruited all these Black students to your program, but you're not hiring more Black faculty. So we organized under a Black collective, and we actually left Jasmine out because we didn't read her as Black. We read her as a Latino. And there wasn't even consciousness for us around the sort of intersection between race and ethnicity. Like we just read her as not Black. So you can't be in the space. At the time, I was like, I didn't understand what the deal was, because she was deeply by being left out of it. And I was like, but you're not Black though. And it took some conversations for me to get that. Because I did read her, not as Black, right? But I read her as something other. And it's still an ongoing developmental process.
Yeah.
For me, I had a former colleague who was Puerto Rican, did not identify as Black, and had a colleague who was Afro-Latino, identified as Black or Puerto Rican. And that friend would always be like, it's so frustrating that she wanted college as Black. Although she's married to a Black man and has Black children, she's very adamant, like, I am not Black. And thinking about it, I just never thought of it as a big deal. She was like, I was deeply problematic, that she wanted college. That part of it.
Yeah, and it's hard for Afro Latinos. So like you were telling her that she's not Black. I feel like almost every single member of the Afro Latinx community has been told that they are not Black, but we have also been told we are not Latino. Right. So as a Black Puerto Rican, feeling like I don't belong in either world is a struggle, right? And I was ultimately accepted by the African American community at my undergrad instead of the Latino community. But I also wonder if it's because my dad was African American. Like, oh, you're Puerto Rican, but you're also Black. But not because my Latino side was also Black, but I didn't necessarily blame them. Like I said, I was still figuring it out, right? I think especially because I didn't grow up with Black people. I didn't grow up around Afro Latinos. Like my mom is very fair skinned. Most of the people in my family are very fair skinned. So I think for me, I just didn't know what that was like when I got to college. And I'm like, yo, like y'all look like me and talk like me, and y'all are embracing that identity. That I think for me, it was a very eye-opening experience.
Embracing that is how you present to just looking at features. I think of like Black celebrities that are Afro-Latino that we may just look at like a Black woman, and we find out later, we're like, oh, because they tend to be maybe more of like my complexion or darker, and they don't maybe necessarily look like features of what we would deem as Latina. So when we see some of them, we're like, oh no, they're Black women. But then for some, it's like, oh, maybe not so much. So I wonder if it's also like features and skin tone too, and who gets embraced and who doesn't get embraced.
Absolutely, right, because we have these preconceptions about what Black looks like, right? We have preconceptions that all Latinas look like J-Lo. I mean, I wish I had her booty, but like, we don't all look like J-Lo, right? And that is okay. Like, that is part of the beauty of the Latinx community. Like, legit, any one of y'all could be members of the community. Because we literally come in all shades. There are blonde hair, blue eyed Puerto Ricans, right? Like, my grandfather is a very, very dark skinned Puerto Rican. Like, we come in all shades, but we've been programmed and socialized to believe that it only looks one way, which is kind of connected to this idea of whiteness, right? Like, this is what it's supposed to look like, and any one of us that don't fit into that mold are then othered and seen as less. See, that's what I'm saying, right? So I think that, and it's interesting because I've also been judged. I remember my friend's boyfriend is very, very dark-skinned Dominican, and I was speaking Spanish one day, and he was like, how do you know Spanish? I told him it's because I'm Puerto Rican. He was like, but you're Black. How can you be Puerto Rican? And he's like 5 shades darker than me, right? So even having to prove my Latino-ness to him, even though he's darker, right? So I feel like he's also, even as a dark-skinned Dominican man, still bought into the idea of what looking like members of our community should be.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment from Dr. Corn in the chat. It says, I teach race and ethnic relations, so 304, and our students tend to struggle with where Latinx folks are positioned in a racial/racist hierarchy. Many see Latinx groups as distinct racial groups, and they get quite confused when we discuss research on self-identity and parallel those experiences with the census racial categories, which do not include Latin.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then it's interesting because I remember when the census first changed, my mom was like, what is this? And like, she crossed it out and wrote, I am Puerto Rican. I was like, Mommy, that's not going to count that way because that's not what it's supposed to be. But she was like, no, like, y'all don't get to put me in these other categories. But it's interesting because when I was born, on my birth certificate, my mom, like I said, is a very fair-skinned Puerto Rican and has her listed as Negro. Because back then it was like either you're white or you're Negro, kind of what that looks like. So yeah, I think both the identity that folks prescribe on us versus our own self-identity, and like one is influencing the other. Identity development is deep, right? And I think I'm grateful that I'm finally at a place where I'm comfortable with it and I love it, but it doesn't make the struggles of being a Black Puerto Rican any easier. Thank y'all for contributing, and thank you for your comments. I'm looking at you, not knowing if you can look at me, but I'm figuring out hybrid. So continuing with colorism, this one says, while light-skinned and white light-skinned Latinos do not benefit from all the privileges, I wrote that twice, all the privileges associated with whiteness, empirical studies have shown that they are better off educationally and socioeconomically in comparison to dark-skinned Latinos. So this is talking more about what that skin privilege looks like. And this was a conversation that I remember having with my mom probably about a year ago, talking about that she has light skin or white privilege because of the way she looks. Mommy didn't like that. And she was like, no, I don't get what white folks get, and I don't have the benefits. But I had to explain to her, it's not necessarily just the benefits, but you also get the consequences of being a Black person in this country. I explained to her, so I used to drive to Atlanta, and I was like, Mommy, every time it's time for me to get gas, like I panic because I'm like, I don't know which exit while driving through the South I can get off of and still make sure that I get home at the end of the day. So like when I get off the exit, like I will drive around until I see a Black person, and then I will get out and get gas. So I'm like, yeah, you guys tell me like you don't have a better credit score because of white privilege, but you also don't have to worry about getting raped or being hung or all of these things that as a Black woman I'm constantly worried about all the time, right? So in the kind of story, I talked about this instance where I was walking home. I think I might have been like 17 or 18, and a car full of white boys pulled up and they just started throwing things at me. And like I oftentimes when I see groups of white boys, like I used to get nervous, right? Because I had PTSD from that. And I'm like, Mommy, like that's not something you worry about. Because when they see her, they don't see a Puerto Rican woman. They don't, and she's like, I'm Puerto Rican. Mommy, don't say you're not Puerto Rican. I'm just saying when folks see you, right, like they're not automatically going to experience that. In our neighborhoods, I would deal with racism a lot. And she didn't realize how racist our community was because they don't see her as a woman of color, right? They see her as a white person, and therefore they're not threatened by her, right? So I think we don't talk about that privilege and what that looks like. But even me, as a Black woman, I have light skin privilege, right? Like there are Black women that are darker than me that are going to be oppressed and marginalized and discriminated against even more, right? So it's not just to say that very fair skinned folks have privilege, like I have light skin privilege as well. Not the type of privilege my mom has, but it's important for us to acknowledge the privileges that we do have. Questions or thoughts about that? I hate trying to breathe through this mask, y'all. I'm really trying. All right, how you on time? Okay. You think we'd be used to it by now? All right, so how do we move forward? When y'all think about anti-Blackness, do you think that our country will ever not be anti-Black? Why not?
I think for a lot of reasons, right? One of the reasons because I don't think people want to.
Okay.
So I talked a lot about this in my class. I should mention it, but if we could figure out ways, like in a pandemic, to like come together and try to mitigate things, and like granted, everybody was not there, right? Like some people still don't believe they're coming, but enough people came together to like organize around it so that we could try to get, the vaccine and get to a solution. If we could come together as a people around that, how come we can't come together as a people around other things that have been plaguing us for way longer? Because we don't want to. Like that's my perspective. I think if people wanted to, could see it like a better tomorrow where we don't have to deal with institutionalized racism. We can actually dismantle like systems of oppression and stuff. But I don't think there's any incentive to actually do that. I think that the country will continue to proclaim that we're trying to get there, but will truly.
Yeah, I think that on that, I don't think people are willing to make that sacrifice because it requires them to lose something, especially white folks to lose that. So they wouldn't do that. So they could say, oh, we support you, but are you willing to make those sacrifices to make systemic changes?
Yeah, I think similarly, the psychological labels of whiteness are huge because right now, I think about my hometown of Louisville, Texas, that until the 80s, there was a racist sign hanging over the downtown. And it's not that Black people weren't present, it was just this made white people feel superior to be able to subjugate Black folks because they're all living in hard conditions. So the psychological and capitalistic things that have to be given up for anti-Blackness to be our leaders. The big ass. And I'm very pessimistic that folks are willing to let go of privileges they have. So, folks can be.
I also think a part of it is that some members of the community just don't believe that anti-racism actually exists, right? Like the ways in which we're discussing it right now, that even within other oftentimes marginalized communities, there's this center of anti-Blackness that's also still present and that folks deal with. And so I think that as a society, and I want to be careful not to overgeneralize, but I think as it relates to racism and anti-Blackness specifically, our community is very adamant about pushing ourselves away from the wounds of our past. We just want to be very far removed, like racism happened so long ago. That's not, where we are as a society when in reality it's deeply rooted in the policies and the it's passed down through generations, and a part of that too, not just racism, but this anti-Black conversation that we're having is also a part of it. And I don't know that folks are maybe at a point in their journey where they are either one, ready to admit it, or two, actually know about it, right? Like to know that this is actually something that it has a name. Yeah.
What do you think would make y'all feel more optimistic? There's a lot of skepticism and pessimism and realistic expectations, right? Because of the world that we live in. But what kind of things would give you hope that things would change?
Don't just talk about, oh, this needs diversity, this needs to anti-racism, we have an anti-racist task force. Okay, what are you actually doing? Because sure, sit in the meeting, face to face, wherever, talk about these things, all day long in abstract, but what does it look like in practice? What are you willing to change? And get away from, well, we haven't done that before, or I don't know, like actually do the work that you've spent hours talking.
Yeah.
On Dr. Paul's point, I think accountability is seeing that manifest into action is important. I actually was just having a conversation with colleagues earlier today about the unfortunate finding of the Black young man at ISU, which I'm a part of their doctoral program, that they today have identified his body. And so there's been this large narrative in the news about how, Black folks don't always get the exposure that we need when we are in a state of crisis, whereas our non-Black counterparts, more specifically, it was around the conversation of the unfortunate incident that happened to the young white lady, and both of their bodies being found, and closure for both of those families being needed. But the how resources had to be pushed for on behalf of the young Black man up at Illinois State when they had actually found his body more than 2 weeks ago. So,
would you mind providing context for those who don't know what incident you're talking about?
absolutely, yes. So there was a young Black man by the name of Jelani Day, who was a student at Illinois State University, which is one of our peer institutions here in the state, who went missing at the end of August, right around August 24th. His mother had reported him missing. Today, they confirmed that the body that was found over Labor Day, from Labor Day holiday on September 4th, was actually his body. And they hadn't had a chance to do the dental identification. But some folks are now, a lot of journalists and media officials are asking the tough questions that we should answer as a community as to why some Black folks just don't receive that same sense of urgency when we are in need of anything, whether that is a similar situation, unfortunately, as the student at ISU or in any instance. So I think a part of that is, I think it would have been helpful that action to come earlier, to know that his body was still there. Had that been, done more quickly, I think that action would have been satisfying to say, you actually care about bringing closure to this family. You actually care about members within the ISU community, and more specifically, you cared about him as a young Black man enough to say, we need to figure out what happened.
Yeah, like show us that Black Lives Matter, right? Like that, like show us that our bodies matter, our grief matters, our psychological well-being, right? So to have to, like, every single day that family was waiting for, right, was hoping that he would come home, and like they elongated their suffering. And of course, they're still suffering now, but like at least they have some closure in terms of like what they knew happened. But yeah, when I think of action that shows that you care about our lives, our well-being. And it's rare that we get to see those actions, especially those actions consistently over time, right? Because everybody was hot and excited, you know, like anti-racism was sexy the last summer, but I'm like, where are y'all now, right? I think for a lot of people, especially after the Derek Chauvin verdict, they're like, okay, we're done, like we're good, like we can go back on our merry way. And us as Black folks are still struggling, right? Like we don't get to turn it off. Like we can't decide, you know what, I'm not going to do the work today, right? Because we wake up every day a threat, perceived as a threat in this country. So let's talk about some of these actions. We just talked about that. I think about actions, we were talking about Dr. Hall, where I think about the difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. And to me, action is the biggest thing. So one of my favorite quotes by James Baldwin says that a child cannot be taught by anyone who despises him. When I think about this, I think about being not racist, right? So a child cannot be taught by a teacher that it is racist or despises him or sees them as less than, right? So to me, that's the not racist part. I've taken his quote a step further and said a child cannot be taught by anyone who is silent about the world that despises him, right? So it's not just good enough that you are not racist and you aren't saying negative things, but you can't be silent about the world that is out there coming for his life. Like you can't be silent about the world that is racist. You have to actually speak out. You have to advocate for children. Like you have to advocate for the Black community. We don't just need your thoughts and prayers. I mean, we never just needed that, right? Like we need actions, we need policy changes, we need practices to change. And people aren't moving fast enough. Like we're literally dying. Our mental health is being impacted by microaggressions. My research looks at the psychological consequences of experiencing microaggressions, and we as Black folks experience them every single day, right? We need to have these conversations, which is, of course, we start with talking, but we can't stop at talking. Everyone okay on time? All right, so I think education is important on multiple levels. Like I told you, even for my own identity development, it wasn't until I got to college and started reading and learning about my own identity that I was able to embrace my own Blackness in terms of how it was related to me being Puerto Rican and not just because I was African American, right? So you think about those numbers from that study, right? So 75% of Mexican, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans have African ancestry. And yeah, like I said, I believe some of those people who didn't identify are not identifying because of anti-Blackness and because of a rejection of their Black identity, but a lot of them just don't know their history, don't know their ancestry. I remember when I went to Puerto Rico, there's, well, there used to be, not anymore, but there was a museum specifically for the African ancestry and history within Puerto Rico. And I remember I was trying to find it and I couldn't find it. So I went to the front desk of the hotel and I asked the woman where it was. And she had never heard of it. It was 2 blocks away from the hotel. And this is a woman who is Puerto Rican, who works in the hotel industry. Literally, her hotel is 2 blocks from this museum, and she didn't even know it was there, right? Because people just don't care about that. And the entire museum is talking about the African ancestry. It was magical and beautiful, and I loved it. And it's no longer there now. It's a floor within the like main museum, which I low-key am happy about because people go to the main museum and at least they'll stumble on it and see it. I don't know that people would voluntarily go because I was one of the only people in the museum when I went, right? So even though this museum is there and the information is there, folks are still not looking into it because they don't want to acknowledge that part. So I think education is important, but then also education in terms of educating those on what anti-Blackness looks like, right? Being able to educate people like, no, like those things you think are just jokes are not just jokes, Like those jokes are rooted in anti-Blackness and are having negative effects on the identity development of Afro-Latinos in our community. Being able to have discussions like this. I think people are afraid to have these talks, which is especially when I do these, I don't lecture and just like teach, like we need to have conversations. Folks need to be able to ask questions. People need to be able to share their stories, right? Which is why I start with a counter story all the time. So people know like it's not just data, it's not just research. Like let's talk about what has actually happened to us. Because there's strength in being able to know that you are not alone. Every single focus group I've ever done with Black women about microaggressions, there's been some form of, wow, so I'm not crazy. Or wow, so it's not just me, it's not just my experience, right? Because people don't talk about it, you often internalize it and feel like it's a personal thing. Like it is a just you, there's something wrong with you. But once we have these open discussions, people are able to see that unfortunately, this is a common experience. It's work when you feel like it. And then research, right? There isn't enough research at all when it comes to the experiences of the Afro-Latinx community. Dr. Haywood's work is great, and we definitely need more of it. I'm actually beginning a research study now that's going to look at how Afro-Latinas experience racial battle fatigue, which talks about the psychological and physiological consequences of experiencing racism and microaggressions, right? So we often talk about some of those psychological impacts, which is like increased anxiety, increased depression, suicidal thoughts, but there are also these physical manifestations in our body as well. So Black folks have higher blood pressure, increased heart rate, stomach ulcer, and all these other things in our bodies because of the racism and microaggressions we experience. So having research that talks about that and brings that stuff to the forefront to then influence and inform the actions that we were talking about. Questions about any of that? All right, questions in general. We got 10 more minutes. Yes. Sure.
But thinking about the comments the professor made too, how much of it you think I'm thinking about like how we define Latinx and Hispanic, like because race is socially constructed and how we define it in the US anyway, but thinking about how some may view it as racial versus ethnicity, even though we know Puerto Rico and Mexican are ethnic, but thinking about also Hispanic as a race, and I think I've seen that in some of my experience, like when we say Black, white, and brown, versus like someone could be like a mix of Black and Latino and stuff, but and seeing like how they define that. I remember one of my friends, she's Latina too, but she's on her birth certificate is white, but she says she doesn't feel white, even though she acknowledges that she's white and has some privileges, but not being taught, like treated way differently too. So I'm even wondering how we define, how we categorize like Hispanic and Latino, Latinx and multiple categories.
And I think that's the problem with social constructions, right? Like there is no, let's say, right or wrong. I mean, there's some trash racist ways to do things, right? But I think, so in terms of, a lot of people don't understand the difference between Hispanic and Latinx. So Hispanic is Spanish-speaking countries specifically, as opposed to Latinx or being Latin American countries. There are also countries that do not speak Spanish that are part of Latin America. So Brazil is part of that. Haiti, I know a lot of Haitians that don't identify as Latin, but Latinx is a broader term. I struggle with saying Black and brown, even though that's what we normally say, because I feel like brown is typically referring to the Latinx community, but then I feel like takes away from the Blackness that exists, the fact that there are indigenous folks and things like that. But then I also know that there are Indians that consider themselves brown, right? So I don't believe it's my job or my place to tell people how to self-identify, right? So I identify as Black, I identify as Afro-Latina, but I know some Black Latinas that don't like the word Afro-Latina, right? So I don't think that there's a right or wrong. I know how I identify, right? But I feel like regardless of what they call it, I think it's important to acknowledge our ancestry. It's important to understand our heritage, but the actual term people use, I'm fine with people using what is comfortable for them. But I don't think there's a right or wrong. Does that make sense? Other questions? Yeah.
Speaking from a place of hope, and how to move forward in a positive direction, do you have any suggestions for how to build community with, individuals who identify as Afro-Latino, in a way of helping to speak to some of the photos that you showed in your presentation, right? Like, and not erasing their experience in this ongoing movement for Black lives, right? Like, because they are part of that conversation. So do you have any suggestions on how to further unify our voices, and be able to utilize that, and this might not be the right word, but to capitalize on that in order to help dismantle these systems of oppression that will ultimately benefit all of our communities?
Are you talking about Black Latinos and non-Latino Black folks? Like as a Black community,
Yeah.
how do we?
Yes, right, like, so there being a struggle for some folks who don't see themselves as Black. How can we have more of these types of conversations? They may not be at a point in their journey where they want to self-identify that way, but seeing the benefit of unifying our voices in order to dismantle the oppression that ultimately all of us may feel
Right.
at some point.
I think the first step is building the community with those Latinx community members that actually identify as Black, right? Because I feel like we're not even there yet, right? So I feel like trying to get non-Black Latinos or those, no, or trying to get Black Latinos that don't identify as that to build community is going to be even harder. So like, let's get to that first part, right? So kind of what JT was talking about in terms of like, he didn't see Dr. Haywood as Black, even though she identified as Black. So like, let's start there with those who actually want to be part of our community. So I feel like we build the community by educating the non-Latino Black community as well. Right. So like they need to know, like, nah, like they're Black just as much as you're Black. Well, we could low-key be from the same African country, right? But we don't know because we were stolen, right? But like I think being able to let people know what those commonalities are, I feel like that'll help bring us together. I think when we're having events, let's say for Black history or for like we're having Black events, being intentional about it, inviting them to, which shows like, no, like I see y'all as us because we are a community. And then maybe once we get there, we can work on those that deny their Blackness and things like that. But that's step like 3 or 4. But I think step 1 is like, let's make sure we're doing things intentionally together. Makes sense. Do you have any questions in the comments? Am I missing anything?
You know, Dr. Maitland said phenomenal job to criticize.
I love you. Thank you. Any other comments? Sure. I didn't hear the end of what you said, but if you need me, I got you. Anyone else? Of course, we still got 4 minutes, but for you, sir, I have hours.
So recently, and I asked this of the other speakers, and they picked out I read recently an article condemning the concept of Latinidad as inherently anti-Black, not just you can share your thoughts on that. Especially because, you know, I hear in your talk the desire for some coming together and inclusion in both Black spaces and Latinx spaces.
That is definitely not a 3 minutes left conversation. But amen, because that's a spicy conversation. So, and for those of y'all, so I just actually did an episode on my show on Monday about the erasure of Afro-Latinas during Latinx Heritage Month, and we talked about Latinidad. We talked about, and I mean, I love my guest, and she was just like, I just don't try to be part of the community anymore because the community doesn't rock for me. The community doesn't care about me. So she rocks with the Black community. Like she no longer sees herself as a member of the Latino community, and not because she doesn't believe in it, but because they don't believe in it, right? So I'm not there yet. And I don't know that I want to be there. Like I want to be part of the Latino community because I feel like it is my community. But when you think about Latinidad, it has never included us as Black folks, right? So when people define it or identify as that, it has always been a certain type of Latinos that gets to claim Latinidad, and those people don't look like me. So a lot of us don't use that term, and there is work, like what you were talking about, you were reading, there's research on it, and a lot of people are rejecting that word, but typically those who are still team Latinidad or white Latinos, right, who haven't been negatively affected by that word and the things associated with that word. But like, I used to use the word, I'm like, oh, that is my identity, right? So like my Blackness, right? And then my Latino, like I used to see that as that word, not realizing the history of the word, the implications of the word, and things like that. Anyone else? All right, I appreciate y'all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones,
You're
for
welcome.
joining us and sharing your story with us and trusting us with those pieces of you. We value you, we affirm you, and we thank you for all that you do for this and for our students. So with that, thank you all for those that have joined us in person, those of us that are
Thank y'all.
here with us virtually. We will have an inclusive conversation tomorrow as well. That'll be held virtually. At 12:15, we invite you to join us for that as well. But until we all see you again, either in person or virtually, we hope that you will take